There is a place on this planet where the cold is not a season. It is a permanent condition, a geological fact, a force so absolute and so unrelenting that it has shaped everything within its reach: the land, the animals, the rivers, the trees, the soil itself, and the people, in ways that are almost impossible to comprehend from the outside. We are talking about Siberia, and specifically the parts of Siberia that most people, even most Russians, will never see and never experience. The parts where the thermometer drops to 60, 70, even 68 degrees below 0 Celsius, where the ground has been frozen solid for tens of thousands of years, where exhaled breath does not simply mist in the air but freezes before it can disperse and falls to the ground as tiny crystals with a soft hissing sound that the people who live there have a name for, where metal snaps without warning, where diesel fuel gels in engines, where the simple act of surviving a single night without shelter is, for most human beings alive today, an impossibility. And yet people live there, not just survive there, not just endure it, live there fully and completely with children and kitchens and traditions and music and humor, and a knowledge of that cold so deep and so specific that it constitutes its own kind of civilization. A civilization built entirely around the problem of existing in conditions that should not permit human existence, and which has been solving that problem with extraordinary ingenuity for thousands of years. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the world at its extremes, not the comfortable edges but the real limits, the places where the gap between what humans can do and what seems possible is at its most extraordinary. This is going to take everything you think you know about cold and survival and human adaptation and turn it completely upside down. We need to start with the cold itself, not the number, not the -60 that everyone quotes when they are talking about Siberia, but the actual physical experience of what that temperature does to the world around you. Because cold at that level is not simply the absence of warmth. It is a force with physical consequences that are almost surreal when you encounter them for the first time. When the temperature drops below -40, which is, incidentally, the one point on the thermometric scale where Fahrenheit and Celsius converge, meaning that -40 is the same number in both systems, things begin to happen that violate your intuitive understanding of how matter behaves. Rubber becomes brittle and shatters. Steel loses its structural integrity and will crack under loads it could easily bear at temperate temperatures. The moisture in your eyes begins to freeze at the outer corners if you keep them open too long. Your eyelashes accumulate frost. The inside of your nose freezes within seconds of stepping outside, a sensation that is simultaneously startling and, according to the people who live with it daily, one that you eventually stop noticing entirely. Trees explode. This is not a metaphor. The moisture inside the cells of a tree freezes and expands, and the tree's outer bark, frozen harder than the interior, cannot flex to accommodate the expansion, and the result is a sharp crack, sometimes loud enough to sound like a rifle shot, that splits the bark and sometimes splits the trunk entirely. In the forests of northeastern Siberia on the coldest winter nights, the sound of freezing trees cracking in the darkness is continuous, a kind of winter percussion that the landscape makes entirely on its own. Boiling water thrown into air at -50 freezes before it reaches the ground. Not all of it, but most of it. The fine droplets that form when hot water meets extremely cold air are small enough to freeze in the fraction of a second they are airborne, and they hit the ground as snow or drift away as ice crystals, depending on the wind. This is one of those phenomena that people who have only experienced temperate cold find difficult to believe until they see it, and seeing it for the first time, even if you have been told about it, is a genuine cognitive shock. The basic physics of it is straightforward enough, but watching water become snow in midair in less than a second rearranges something in how you understand the word cold. The landscape that this cold has created over tens of thousands of years is unlike any other landscape on Earth. The most fundamental fact about the ground in the coldest parts of Siberia is that it is frozen, not seasonally frozen, not frozen in winter thawed in summer, frozen, permanently frozen. Permafrost, the layer of ground that has remained below 0 degrees Celsius continuously for at least 2 years and in many parts of Siberia for more than 10,000 years, underlies virtually the entire region. In some places it extends downward for more than 1.5 kilometers. 1.5 kilometers of frozen earth, frozen deeper than the deepest mines in most parts of the world, frozen since before agriculture existed, since before the first cities, since before the entire span of recorded human history. This permafrost is the skeleton of the Siberian landscape and everything above it. Every tree, every building, every road, every river is in some sense a guest of this frozen ground, negotiating with it constantly, working around its properties and its limitations. The permafrost does not permit roots to go deep. Trees in permafrost regions have shallow root systems that spread horizontally rather than penetrating downward, which is why the spruce and larch forests of Siberia look the way they do. Why the trees lean at odd angles in what locals call drunken forests, because the thin active layer of soil above the permafrost is unstable, shifting and heaving with the seasonal freeze and thaw cycle, tilting trees that have been growing for a century into precarious angles. The forest looks drunk because the ground is moving, slowly, imperceptibly in human time scales, but moving, and the trees are recording its movement in their posture. The rivers of Siberia are the largest in Russia, and several of them are among the largest rivers on Earth. The Lena, the Yenisei, the Ob, the Kolyma, these are rivers of enormous volume, fed by the vast catchment areas of the Siberian Plateau and its surrounding mountain ranges. And their behavior in the extreme cold is one of the most dramatic natural phenomena in the region. The rivers freeze, obviously. But they do not freeze from bank to bank uniformly in the way that smaller rivers in temperate climates freeze. They freeze in stages and in layers and in ways that create structures of ice that are architecturally complex and sometimes genuinely dangerous. The Lena River, which is the subject of particular attention because of its role in the life of the communities along its banks, forms ice that can be several meters thick in the deep winter. The ice road that forms over its surface is used as a highway, a literal road with posted speed limits and kilometer markers and dedicated maintenance crews, through which trucks carry goods to communities that in summer are accessible only by boat or by small aircraft, and which in the transitional seasons of freeze and thaw are accessible almost not at all. The window of the ice road is precious. The communities along the Lena plan their annual logistics around it. They stockpile fuel and food and building materials in the weeks when the ice is thick enough to bear heavy loads. They know, by long accumulated knowledge, the sections of the river where the ice is most reliable and the sections where underwater springs or currents make it thin and treacherous in ways that are not visible on the surface. The ice roads of Siberia are not a curiosity or a tourist attraction. They are infrastructure. They are the veins through which supplies flow to communities that could not survive without them, and the knowledge of how to read ice, how to assess its thickness and its composition and its reliability, is a practical skill of the same order of importance as the knowledge of how to read weather or maintain an engine. People have died on bad ice. Communities remember the stories of trucks that went through and drivers who did not come back, and those stories are not just tragedies but education, passed down as specific knowledge about specific places and specific conditions. Now let us go to the place that holds the record. The place that is, by multiple measurements and multiple accounts, the coldest inhabited place on Earth. It is a small town called Oymyakon, and it sits in the Republic of Sakha, also known as Yakutia, in the extreme northeast of Siberia, in a river valley surrounded by mountains that form a natural bowl trapping cold air in the winter darkness. The official record temperature recorded there in 1924 was -71.2 degrees Celsius. Other measurements have put it slightly higher or slightly lower depending on the equipment and the methodology, but no one seriously disputes that Oymyakon is in practical terms the coldest place where human beings permanently reside. There are colder temperatures recorded at Antarctic research stations, but those are not towns in the full sense of the word. Oymyakon is a town. People are born there and grow old there and die there. Children go to school there when the temperature is above -52, which is the point at which the school closes. Above -52 you go to school. Below it, you stay home. This is a rule that children in Oymyakon grow up with in the same way that children elsewhere grow up with rules about when to wear a raincoat. The town has a population of around 500 people, give or take, depending on the season and the year, and it has been inhabited for a very long time. Before the Soviet era, before the town's infrastructure was built, the valley was used as a winter camp by the Yakut and Evenki peoples who moved their reindeer herds through the region, and the name Oymyakon comes from the Yakut language, one translation being something like unfrozen water, referring to a hot spring in the valley that stays liquid even through the deepest cold, because it emerges from the geothermal warmth below the permafrost. That hot spring was literally what made human life in this valley possible during the nomadic era, a source of water that did not require the energy-expensive process of melting ice or snow. It was a geographical gift in a landscape that does not give gifts easily. The daily life of people in Oymyakon in winter is a masterclass in practical problem-solving at the extremes of what is possible. Getting a car started in the morning is not a matter of turning a key, it is a procedure. Vehicles, if they must be parked outside, are often left running continuously through the winter because the cost of the fuel to idle overnight is less than the risk of not being able to restart a dead engine in temperatures that will gel the diesel and freeze every fluid in the system within hours of shutdown. Some households keep their vehicles in heated garages, but not everyone has that luxury, and the ones who do not have developed routines of daily maintenance that would seem obsessive anywhere else in the world but in Oymyakon are simply ordinary. You check the oil. You check the battery. You make sure the block heater is working. You do this because the alternative, a vehicle that will not start when you need it, is not merely an inconvenience but potentially a matter of survival. The food that people in Oymyakon eat reflects the constraints of the environment with a directness that can seem brutal from outside. Fresh fruits and vegetables are effectively unavailable for most of the year. The growing season, such as it is a narrow window of continuous light in which the surface soil above the permafrost thaws and warms enough to permit some crops, some root vegetables, some cabbages, some hardy greens to grow with extraordinary speed, driven by the 24 hours of daylight that the subarctic summer provides. This window is measured in weeks, not months, and when it ends fast. The cold comes back before you are ready for it, every time, even when you have been ready for it every year of your life. So the traditional diet of Oymyakon and of Yakutia more broadly is built around what the land reliably provides: meat, fish, reindeer and horse and elk and the various game birds and animals of the forest and river. And the remarkable thing about the meat diet of this extreme cold is not just its nutritional necessity but its physical form. The cold is so deep and so reliable that it functions as a freezer of essentially unlimited capacity and essentially perfect reliability. Food is stored outside, frozen solid indefinitely, safely, without any refrigeration equipment because the refrigeration is simply the air around you. Frozen fish and frozen horse meat are Yakut staples, eaten in ways that reflect the temperature of their storage. Stroganina is raw frozen fish or raw frozen meat, shaved with a sharp knife into thin curls and eaten immediately, dipped in salt or a simple seasoning. The flesh so cold that it numbs the tongue initially before the flavor opens up as it begins to thaw. It is one of those foods that exists nowhere else in the world in quite this form, that could only have developed in a place where the cold is absolute and the raw material is perpetually, reliably, perfectly preserved by the temperature of the air. The Yakut people, whose homeland encompasses most of the Republic of Sakha and who are one of the largest indigenous nations in Siberia, have a relationship with the cold that goes far beyond simple adaptation. They have a cultural philosophy, a set of values and practices and aesthetic sensibilities that are rooted in and inseparable from the extreme nature of their environment. The Yakut language has a vocabulary for cold and ice and snow that is, in the way of all such claims about Arctic languages, sometimes exaggerated but nonetheless reflects a genuine attention to the varieties of winter experience that a language developing in a warm climate simply never needed to develop. The precise word for the way frost forms on eyelashes is different from the word for the frost that forms on the interior walls of a house. The word for the ice that forms on a river's surface in autumn is different from the word for midwinter river ice. The word for blizzard is different from the word for the ground blizzard that picks up fallen snow without any new snow falling. This is not linguistic trivia. This is a vocabulary of survival, every distinction encoding information about conditions that matter, practically and immediately, to the people who use the words. The traditional dwelling of the Yakut people is the balagan, a log frame structure with walls of a specific construction, logs laid horizontally and chinked with a mixture of moss and clay and earth, with a turf and earth roof that provides an extraordinary insulating layer, and a design so well adapted to the conditions of Yakutian winter that it has survived alongside modern construction not because people cannot build other things, but because in certain circumstances nothing else works as well. The geometry of the balagan, low and compact to minimize surface area and therefore heat loss, with a single small door oriented away from the prevailing wind, with small windows covered with scraped cow stomach membrane in the traditional form and glass in the modern, with a massive central stove that was the organizing principle of the entire interior, is a response to the cold that is almost mathematically precise in its logic. Every choice, the low ceiling that keeps warm air close to the inhabitants, the thick walls that take hours to cool even after the fire dies, the way the interior space was organized to keep the sleeping areas away from the walls and close to the heat source, reflects a knowledge of thermodynamics that was arrived at not by equation, but by the much slower and more costly method of lived experience across many generations. The reindeer herders of Siberia present perhaps the most extreme version of human life in this cold, because they do not live in fixed settlements at all. Or rather, they have not traditionally done so and many still do not. The Evenki, the Nenets, the Chukchi, the Nganasan, the various indigenous peoples who follow reindeer herds across the vast tundra and taiga of Siberia, live in a relationship with their animals and their landscape that is one of the oldest and most sophisticated human adaptations to extreme cold that exists. The reindeer are not simply livestock. They are the engine of the entire system. They provide meat and blood and fat for food. They provide hides for clothing and shelter. They are the transport, carrying loads and pulling sleds across terrain that is often impassable by any other means. Their behavior, their movements, their health, their reactions to weather and terrain are the primary text that the herder reads in order to understand where to go and when to go there. The herder's knowledge is not about the landscape in the abstract. It is about the landscape as experienced by and through the reindeer, who are themselves exquisitely calibrated to conditions that would kill most other large mammals. Reindeer can smell vegetation under a meter of snow. They paw through it to reach the lichens and sedges beneath, and a herd moving across a snowfield, stopping and pawing and feeding, is reading the landscape through senses that their human companions have learned to interpret. When the reindeer become anxious when they bunch or begin to move in a particular direction without apparent cause. The experienced herder pays attention because the animals are responding to something, a change in wind, a smell of predator, a subtle shift in snow conditions that the herder's own senses have not yet registered. The relationship is a continuous conversation conducted not in words but in the behavioral language of animals and the interpretive skill of humans who have been attending to that language for a very long time. The Nenets of the Yamel Peninsula in the far northwest of Siberia are perhaps the best known of Siberia's reindeer peoples, partly because the Yamel Peninsula has become the subject of significant attention due to its enormous natural gas reserves and the conflict between industrial development and traditional nomadic life that those reserves have brought. But let us stay with what their daily life actually involves, because it is extraordinary in a way that energy politics tends to obscure. The Nenets follow their herds across seasonal migration routes that can cover more than 1,000 kilometers in a year. In winter they are on the southern tundra and the edges of the taiga. In summer they move north to the Arctic coast, following the animals which are following the vegetation and moving away from the insects that torment them in the brief summer warmth. This migration is not casual wandering. It is a precise, annually repeated movement across a landscape that the herders know intimately, every river crossing and every stretch of good pasture, and every place where the snow conditions are treacherous, and every place where shelter can be found in a storm. The chum, the conical tent of the Nenets, is their home through all of this. It is made of reindeer skins in winter, up to 50 skins for a large family chum, and canvas covers in the transitional seasons over a framework of wooden poles that travel with the family. Setting up and taking down the chum is work that falls primarily to the women, and it can be done in about 40 minutes by an experienced family, which is relevant because in a blizzard on the open tundra, the difference between a chum that is up and one that is not is, again, the difference between life and death. The interior of the chum, heated by a central iron stove burning wood or coal, can reach a comfortable temperature even when the outside temperature is -50, because the double layer of skins provides insulation comparable to a very high-quality sleeping bag, and the geometry of the cone efficiently concentrates heat at the level where the people inside are sitting and sleeping. The knowledge required to maintain a chum, to select and prepare and sew the skins, to manage the poles and the positioning in different wind conditions, to regulate the fire for optimal warmth without overheating or smoking the interior, is substantial, and it is the kind of knowledge that takes years to acquire fully. The women who make chum covers and clothing from reindeer skin are practicing a craft that is also survival technology, and the difference between a well-made skin garment and a poorly made one can be measured in heat loss, in the vulnerability of the wearer to frostbite and hypothermia, in the margin between safe and dangerous that in these conditions is always narrower than it looks from outside. The clothing of Siberia's indigenous peoples is, in its engineering, some of the most sophisticated cold-weather technology ever developed. The Nenets and Evenki and Yakut and other groups developed, through long trial and the occasional catastrophic error, systems of layered reindeer skin clothing that manage body heat and moisture with a precision that modern technical outdoor clothing companies are still trying to replicate. Reindeer fur has a structure at the fiber level that is hollow, providing extraordinary insulation while remaining relatively light. The fur of a reindeer calf, used for the innermost layer of clothing in the most extreme cold weather traditions, is finer and denser than adult reindeer fur, and the traditional two-layer system of wearing one garment with the fur facing inward and a second with the fur facing outward creates a microclimate around the body that can maintain warmth even in the most severe cold. The inner fur traps warm air against the skin. The outer fur sheds wind and snow and prevents the inner layer from becoming wet. The gap between the layers allows moisture from the body to escape without allowing cold air in. The cut of the garments is as important as the material. The traditional malitsa of the Nenets, a pullover garment with an integrated hood and attached mittens that can be worn as a complete upper body covering with no gaps at any joint, is designed so that every point of potential heat loss, wrists, neck, hem, is addressed through the cut and construction of the garment itself rather than through additional pieces that might shift or come loose. You cannot design this by calculation alone. You design it by knowing the cold with your body over many years and many mistakes, and then the design is refined and passed forward, each generation inheriting not just the pattern but the understanding of why the pattern is the way it is. Let us go deeper into the winter of Yakutia, because there are aspects of life in extreme cold that do not involve survival in the immediate physical sense, but which reveal the depth of what it means to actually live in this environment rather than simply endure it. Because the people of Yakutia have a cultural life of considerable richness, and much of it is inseparable from the cold. Usiak is the great summer festival of the Yakut people, celebrated at the June solstice when the sun barely sets, and the world is briefly, violently, almost incomprehensibly green and warm. It is a festival of fire and light and horse and fermented mare's milk called kumis, and it is celebrated with a fervor that is directly proportional to the length and severity of the winter just survived. You cannot understand Usiak, the intensity of its joy and its communal energy, without understanding what precedes it. The months of cold and darkness that make the arrival of warmth and light feel like something close to a miracle, even when you have experienced it every year of your life. The festival is a response to the winter in the same way that the clothing and the food and the architecture are responses to the winter. It is the cultural counterpart to the thermal insulation. It is what keeps the inner life warm. The Alonko, the traditional Yakut epic poetry, is another form of cultural warmth in this sense. The Alonko are long narrative poems, sometimes taking several days to perform in full, recited by specialist performers called alonkasats in a distinctive stylized voice that is different from both speech and ordinary song. They tell stories of heroes and spirits and the layered world of Yakut cosmology, a universe divided into upper, middle, and lower realms connected by a great world tree, populated by various categories of spiritual beings whose relationships with the human world require constant negotiation and management. The Alonko have been recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, and they are one of the most substantial bodies of oral epic literature in the world, comparable in scope and ambition to the Iliad or the Mahabharata, except that they developed in a river valley in northeastern Siberia among a people who were simultaneously figuring out how to survive -70 degrees. The parallel tracks of cultural sophistication and physical survival in extreme conditions are not separate things. They are the same project, conducted at different registers. The people who maintained the epic tradition through the centuries of Yakutian winter were the same people who knew how to build a balagan and Red River ice and manage a reindeer herd. The cultural life and the survival life are not in tension. They are expressions of the same underlying fact, which is that these are fully human communities, not merely surviving but living in every sense of that word. The geology beneath Yakutia adds another layer of strangeness to the story. The permafrost that underlies the entire region is not simply frozen ground in the sense of frozen water in soil. It is a vast repository, a cold archive. Preserved within it, in extraordinary condition, are the remains of animals from the Pleistocene, the ice age that ended roughly 11,000 years ago, animals that walked the Siberian landscape when the climate was different, and the human occupation of the region was different, and much of what we think of as the modern world did not yet exist. Woolly mammoths, whose extinction is one of the great mysteries of deep prehistory, have been found in the Siberian permafrost in states of preservation that include not just bones and teeth but complete skin, fur, internal organs, stomach contents. Scientists have found mammoth remains whose fur still shows its original color, a reddish-brown that is not visible in the fossils that constitute most of the world's record of prehistoric fauna. The stomach contents of permafrost mammoths have been examined, and the specific plants the animals ate in their last meal before death have been identified. This is the quality of preservation the cold of Siberia is capable of. It is not preservation in the sense of fossils, of minerals slowly replacing organic material over millions of years. It is preservation in the sense of a deep freeze, the original material maintained in a state so close to its original condition that the proteins can still be analyzed, the DNA can still sometimes be extracted, and Russian and international scientists are seriously discussing the possibility of using that preserved genetic material in programs to restore something like the woolly mammoth to the Siberian tundra. The permafrost is melting. This is one of the most significant facts of our current geological moment, and nowhere is it more dramatically visible than in Siberia. As the global climate warms, the permafrost, which has been stable for thousands of years, is beginning to thaw from the top down, and the consequences of this thawing are already visible and are accelerating. The drunken forests are becoming more pronounced, as the ground beneath them becomes less stable. Buildings and roads and infrastructure constructed on the assumption of stable frozen ground are cracking and shifting as the ground changes beneath them. The coastlines of the Arctic Ocean, where permafrost cliffs drop directly into the sea, are eroding at rates that are shocking even to scientists who have been tracking the process. Entire islands of permafrost have disappeared within the span of a decade. And from the thawing permafrost, ancient organic material that has been frozen for 10,000 years is beginning to decompose for the first time in all those millennia, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, which in turn accelerates the warming that is causing the thawing, which releases more carbon, which causes more warming. The permafrost of Siberia contains, by some estimates, roughly twice the amount of carbon currently present in the atmosphere. The thawing of that permafrost represents a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing cycle that climate scientists identify as one of the most significant potential drivers of future warming, and it is already in motion. Communities that live on this ground are watching it change in real time. The elders of Yakutian villages describe the changes in terms that are specific and grounded in long observation. The lake that was here 30 years ago is gone, drained when the permafrost beneath it thawed and the water seeped away. The riverbank that provided a landing for boats has collapsed. The section of tundra that was solid enough to drive a vehicle across in April is now unreliable in March. The ice road season is shorter. The conditions that traditional knowledge was built to navigate are shifting in ways that the traditional knowledge was not designed to accommodate, because the knowledge was built for a cold that was consistent across the span of human memory in this place, and now the cold is not consistent in the same way. This is one of the most profound aspects of what is happening in extreme Siberia right now, and it is not well enough understood in the places where decisions about climate policy are made. The people who live in the coldest places on Earth, who have built civilizations of extraordinary sophistication specifically calibrated to those conditions, are watching the conditions that their civilization is built on begin to destabilize. The Balagan needs permafrost to be stable to rest on. The ice roads need deep winter cold to form reliably. The food storage that depends on the air temperature requires the air temperature to be what it has always been. The reindeer migration routes require the lichens to be in the places they have always been, accessible under the snowpack in the ways they have always been accessible. When the ground changes and the snow changes and the timing of seasons shifts, the calibration of a civilization built to operate within specific parameters begins to fail. Let us talk about the city, because Siberia is not only remote villages and nomadic herders. It contains cities, real cities with universities and opera houses and traffic jams and coffee shops and every other feature of modern urban life. Cities that also happen to sit on permafrost and experience winters that would shut down most other cities on Earth. Yakutsk is the capital of the Republic of Sakha and is frequently cited as the coldest city in the world, a distinction it holds with a certain local pride. It has a population of around 300,000 people. It has a university, the Northeastern Federal University, with research programs in permafrost science and Arctic ecology that are among the most important in the world. It has a theater. It has restaurants serving cuisine that blends Yakut traditional ingredients with modern culinary sensibilities. It has bars and clubs where people go in the winter evenings when the temperature outside is -50, bundled in furs and technical outerwear, to stand in line waiting for a bouncer to let them in, exactly as people do in cities around the world where the problem is not cold but cover charges. The infrastructure of Yakutsk is a lesson in the specific challenges of building and maintaining a city on permafrost. Buildings cannot simply be placed on the ground. Or rather they can be, but if you do, the warmth of the building's foundation begins to thaw the permafrost beneath it, which then destabilizes the ground, which causes the building to shift and crack and eventually become uninhabitable. The solution, which sounds counterintuitive until you think it through, is to build buildings on stilts, elevating them above the ground so that cold air can circulate freely beneath the structure, maintaining the permafrost in its frozen state. Yakutsk is a city of buildings on stilts, some of them barely perceptible, some of them raising the structure a meter or more above the actual ground. The space beneath is used for storage in some cases, or simply left open to the cold air that keeps the ground beneath frozen and the ground beneath the building stable. The water supply system of Yakutsk is another engineering challenge specific to its conditions. Underground pipes cannot simply be buried at the depths that would protect them from freezing in most cities, because in Yakutsk the permafrost extends so deep and the winter cold is so severe that pipes buried at any practical depth will freeze. The solution is to run the water and sewer pipes above ground, insulated and heated, running on trestles or along elevated walkways, which gives Yakutsk a distinctive visual character. A city in which the mechanical systems of modern life that are invisible in most cities, buried beneath streets and beneath buildings, are here out in the open, running along the surface where they can be maintained and insulated and heated against the cold that will otherwise destroy them. The heating system of Yakutsk, as of most Siberian cities, is a centralized district heating system, a Soviet-era infrastructure in which hot water is produced in centralized plants and piped through insulated underground tunnels to every building in the city. It is a system that has significant inefficiencies and significant maintenance challenges, but which has the enormous advantage of scale, the centralized production of heat being more efficient than thousands of individual heating systems, and which in the context of a city where the heating infrastructure is literally the difference between habitation and abandonment, is treated as the most critical piece of civic infrastructure that exists. When the heating system fails in Yakutsk in January, it is not an inconvenience. It is an emergency. Pipes freeze within hours, buildings become uninhabitable within days. The municipal government of Yakutsk treats heating system maintenance and emergency response as its highest operational priority, above roads, above sanitation, above virtually everything else, because the hierarchy of needs in a city at -50 is different from the hierarchy of needs in a city where the worst-case winter scenario is a heavy snowfall. The people who maintain this infrastructure, the engineers and technicians who work the heating systems and the water supply and the power grid of Yakutsk and the dozens of smaller Siberian cities in similar conditions, are practicing a form of industrial heroism that receives essentially no attention outside of Russia. Their work is not glamorous. It involves going out in conditions that should keep everyone indoors. To repair systems that are failing in the worst possible weather, often at night, often in the wind, often with equipment that is itself being stressed by the cold. They are the people who keep the lights on and the water flowing and the heat running in places where none of those things would exist without constant active effort. The cold wants to stop everything. These people do not let it stop. The Trans-Siberian Railway is perhaps the most famous human artifact in Siberia, the 9,200-kilometer rail line that connects Moscow to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast, and which, when it was completed in 1916, was arguably the most ambitious engineering project in human history up to that point. But the Trans-Siberian is not the only railway in Siberia that tells a story of extreme conditions and extraordinary human effort. The Baikal-Amur main line, the BAM, which runs to the north of the Trans-Siberian through even more difficult terrain, is in many ways a more extreme story. The BAM was built primarily in the Soviet era, much of it during the 1970s and 1980s, through terrain that defied normal engineering methods at every turn. Permafrost required special construction techniques for every bridge and tunnel and section of roadbed. Mountain ranges required tunnels through rock that was so cold and so unstable that standard tunneling methods frequently failed. Rivers that were different in character in summer and winter, and in the transitional seasons required different approaches to bridge construction than anything the engineers had encountered in the more temperate parts of the Soviet Union. Workers were brought in from all over the Soviet Union, young people in many cases, brought by the combination of genuine idealism about building something significant and the substantial wage bonuses that came with working in such conditions. Many of them stayed. The towns along the BAM are populated in part by the descendants of those workers, people who came from Ukraine or Belarus or the Caucasus to build a railway and then found themselves, after a few years of the BAM's particular life, unable to imagine living anywhere else. The culture of the BAM towns is a specific Siberian culture of workers and builders, different from the indigenous Yakut or Evenki cultures that preceded them in the same territory but genuine in its own way, with its own music and humor and sense of identity, rooted in the shared experience of having chosen to be in one of the most difficult places to build anything and having built it anyway. The BAM remains in operation, carrying freight and occasional passengers through landscapes that most people will never see, through winter conditions that would shut down the rail systems of every major economy in the world. The maintenance of the line through Siberian winter is a permanent, ongoing exercise in cold-weather engineering that has no parallel elsewhere. Lake Baikal. We cannot talk about Siberia without Lake Baikal, which is one of the genuinely extraordinary places on Earth and which, in winter, becomes something that has to be seen to be processed. Baikal is the deepest lake in the world, holding roughly 20% of all the liquid fresh water on Earth's surface. It is 636 kilometers long and up to 80 kilometers wide, and it is old, ancient in the way that only a handful of geological features are ancient, somewhere between 25 and 35 million years old, which makes it the oldest lake on Earth and explains the extraordinary diversity of life it contains, species that have evolved in isolation over tens of millions of years and exist nowhere else, including the Baikal seal, the only freshwater seal species in the world, and thousands of species of tiny crustaceans and other invertebrates that form the basis of the lake's ecosystem. In winter, Baikal freezes, but a lake of this depth and this volume does not freeze easily or uniformly. The ice of Baikal in winter is one of the most extraordinary natural materials in the world. It forms in plates and ridges, cracking as it grows, and the plates jostle against each other, creating the structures called hummocks and ridges, sometimes rising a meter or more above the surrounding ice surface, like the pressure ridges of sea ice but formed in fresh water and therefore cleaner and often more transparent. The transparency of Baikal's winter ice is remarkable. In places